all our learners, welcome to CEC online lecture. The topic of analysis that we will deliberate upon is the future of globalization. We all know globalization is a very hotly debated concept in the realm of human civilization, social sciences, media, policy making, amongst others. Globalization has led to space-time compression. It has led to the ambit of integration, interrelations, exchange propelled by new discoveries, new innovations in transport, communication, technology, amongst others. Now, with this phase of human history, it is often debated that whether globalization is a myth or reality. There are debates among the hyper-globalists, the skeptics, the transformationalists as to how globalization has been a new perspective or not for our human civilization. Then above all, how theorists have also looked at globalization from different dimensions. For Giddens, it is about intensification of interstate relations. For Gilpin, it is focusing on integration of world economy. For Harvey, there is another sociological dimension, namely that is space-time compression, whereas for Skold, it is presenting another insight, that is deterritorialization. So therefore, we see that how one phenomena of globalization has been perceived under different lights, from the idea of David Hell that it is leading to rise of cosmopolitan democracy with rise of global norms, to the Marxist perspective that ultimately globalization is akin to the forces of capitalism leading to more exploitation, wherein the rich countries prosper and the poor countries suffer. Then we have seen that how over the phases of history, globalization 1.0 was different from globalization 2.0, which was distinct from 3.0 and its contemporary phase, the word coined at the World Economic Forum, that is globalization 4.0. Now we all know that we in the world right now have a shared future. No doubt, how much we talk about looking inwards, how much we talk about closing down, shutting down, yet nonetheless, one cannot ignore that how today with globalization, our gains as well as our risks, our advantages as well as our losses and crises have a shared input, and this very dimension of a common future demands collective thought process on what could be the future of globalization. No doubt, at one hand, it did lead to many gains, namely increase in global markets, increase in volume of world trade, increase at new ambit of engagement and arrangement with new discoveries and innovation in technology. But at the other hand, the idea of global village, what Marshall McLuhan says, or the idea that what Milton Friedman says, that world is flat, this cannot be ignored with other perspectives offered by Joseph Stiglitz, that is globalization and its discontents, namely how where one of the key drivers of international globalization, they were lacking in terms of deficit of transparency, accountability, democracy from the larger management of global issues. And above all that, whether the big question that should we just recall globalization, should we just reverse globalization, or the other input that no, we must look into reforming globalization. So all these issues are key inputs that one has to take into while looking into the future of globalization 4.0, and above all looking at that whether the idea of shared existence, the idea of collective efforts, the idea of jointly linked destinies, how do we manage through global issues from climate change to gender budgeting to pandemics to technological divide, amongst all of it, how do we wedge through, how do we move through these crisis. We have a look now on the various perspectives offered in order to deliberate whether globalization is really a new phase in human history. When we look at what skeptics say, for the skeptics, globalization definitely does not challenge the authority of the state. The state is still most the important actor in international relations. Integration and exchange definitely may be there. There may be increase in global trade and flow of global finance. However, this cannot take the merit that state has, the important significance the state has in international relations. The hyper globalists definitely look at the various benefits that are there with globalization, how today the idea that state is an important actor is looking coexisting with new processes of globalization. The Transformational List look at globalization as a very significant aspect in human history. Now this brings to us another thorny question, that is they always associated while we understand globalization, is globalization a myth or reality? Now, when we hear about rise of communication revolution, new developments in technology, new ambit in the realm of information technology, definitely globalization seemed to be a unique phase in human history. When one hears about rise of new norms, when we hear about the idea of cosmopolitan democracy, rise of global governance mechanism, globalization no doubt presents to be a unique moment in human civilization. Then at the same time there are huge critiques, to name a few, Hurst and Thompson, who often look and debunk globalization akin to a myth. Then at the same time, while we are deliberating on globalization, one cannot ignore that the effects of globalization have not been even. At one point of time, it did lead to increase in trade. But however, at the same time, critics point out how the agenda of trade favored the developed world more than the developing world. How today the issue of subsidies remain unsolved in terms of the interest of the developing nations. How trade, marks, patents, copyrights are often used as instrument of domination against unbalanced research and development funding when it comes to the rich north versus the poor south. Then at the same time, when we look at the effects of globalization, today it is often said that when we hear about prevalence of rural urban divide in many nations across the globe, this definitely puts a question mark that whether globalization covered the globe equally, or was it limited to only few segments and sections of society. Further, when we try to understand globalization, quite often critics debunk it as nothing but an expression, an extension of capitalism. The Marxist critique of globalization is premised on the same notion, that ultimately it is the class struggle that is defining the world politics. Lenin remarked that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. Quite often one looks at the analysis presented by the world system theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, the American sociologist who presented to us the world system theory in understanding of global relations and global affairs, wherein the dichotomy between core, periphery and semi-periphery, and the flow of economic cycles wherein the development of the core, namely the developed world, came at the expense of underdevelopment of the periphery, namely via exploitation of cheap labor, raw material. So globalization is often looked upon in this sense as nothing but just favoring the class interest, furthering capitalist exploitation and domination. Then when we understand it whether globalization is a myth or reality, one cannot ignore that today when we talk about prevalence of standards, rise of new cultural norms, use of standard languages, then at the same time there are critiques that put a question mark over this rise of cultural homogeneity, namely in the sense of ignoring of the grassroots culture, ignoring of the indigenous ways of life. And this often remarks that how globalization paid more dividends to one aspect of lifestyle. It privileged one way of lifestyle over the other. Similarly, when we are trying to delve deeper into globalization, it is very essential for us to comprehend that as the causes of globalization move forward, globalization too is witnessing changes. As we have remarked that globalization is not new, but because of unprecedented scale, velocity, extensity of the present neoliberal driven globalization, today world is often remarked to be on a unique phase of human history. It is very essential to understand that quite often today nations are remarking that world needs to close borders. Today countries are putting up clauses again in order to favor their domestic economy, in order to strengthen the indigenous industry and give more emphasis to the local inputs over the idea of opening up, over the idea of connecting borders. This also brings to us a very important question that whether the gains of globalization were equally available to all as the world witnessed globalization in the post-Cold War period. We all know that in its earlier variants, globalization was promoted, namely when we see with the rise of industrial revolution. Globalization was promoted after the Second World War with deliberations to move towards joint mechanism to factor in variables, aspects in order to ensure smooth flow of global trade and finance. One witnessed how with the rise of dot-com boom, with the rise of World Wide Web, world definitely witnessed a new heights in globalization syndrome in post-Cold War era. In the post-Cold War era, alongside with the establishment of US hegemony, one also saw the rise of not only dissolution of the Soviet Union, not only disintegration of the Soviet Union, but at the same time rise of new multiple centers of power. And with this, one of the idea that led to the rise of this multiple centers of power was the force of globalization, which propelled increase in intergovernmental mechanisms, which propelled increase in political relations in nations across the globe. Now this brings to us the another important aspect, namely that whether these gains were equally available to all. Today, world over, there is a rise in citizenry promoting, requesting their respective governments to cater to the domestic, to favor the domestic over the idea of integration. So therefore, when we see present day globalization, which the World Economic Forum often tags at globalization 4.0, globalization 4.0 will also witness changes in its context and other aspects. Namely, in its earlier version, globalization witnessed industrial revolution, where there was changes in the production and distribution mechanism. Similarly, in globalization 4.0, in present times, we are hearing about rise of industry 4.0, artificial intelligence. This brings to us that whether the new world that we are thinking to conceptualize with globalization, whether to place how to secure more ambits in terms of factoring in resources. Then a look back towards the causes of globalization. We all know increase in transport, communication, information technology, optic fiber, satellite communication, all of it led to the world becoming a global village. Then at the same time, one cannot ignore that as more developments are taking place in technology, things are also at a very fast level becoming redundant. Or for the same matter that we hear about rise of attrition in dot-com jobs. So this brings to us an important aspect when we deliberate on the future of globalization, that nations across have to now factor in technology as a new variant and a very important variable of power. Then when we often look about the future of globalization, one cannot ignore sustainability as an important aspect there. Today, we all know that all nations are striving to deal with environmental issues, global warming, climate change, and this has a direct link with the way we have used and managed our precious resources of the earth. This has a bearing on how countries and nations and their respective governments make policies in and strengthen the environment. Today, multinational corporations, international organizations are requesting domestic governments to ensure not only exploring new sources of energy, but at the same time putting in sustainability as a value of supreme significance. We all know at the Earth Summit 1992, the idea of sustainable development, that is, the development that does not hinder the ability of the future generations to live healthily or that of planet Earth to be safe and secure, was coined. Now, this idea of sustainable development has been enshrined in the idea of sustainability, and this is why today one deliberates on future of globalization. Sustainability is one aspect that policymakers, national governments of various states are looking at. Then another important aspect of future of globalization is that how today's security has become multi-dimensional. The earlier idea of security was seen in the sense of military, that is, saving the nation from warfare. But today, unfortunately, warfare has acquired new dimensions, and this has a bearing on the understanding of security also, which where any takers for future of globalization must take into account. The 1994 Human Development Report put forward the idea of human security, wherein in all its 7 dimensions, from food, health, community, amongst others, they were looked as important variables for countries to look into account for a holistic comprehension of what it actually means for an individual, for a state which that is home to all the individuals to be secure. Therefore, once we look at globalization 4.0 or the future of globalization, wherein the world over there is a movement, there is an attempt to think about protectionism, that is primacy to the domestic over the global, one has to take into account that today the dimensions that are there, the aspects that are there within the aspect of globalization, they are also witnessing a change, and changes in the conception of security from a status perspective towards a larger focus on the human, on the individual, is one aspect that globalization and the people taking its future forward must take into account. Then another aspect, while we deliberate the future of globalization, one has to look at the gender perspective. That is, there is a need to understand that whether the forces that have been driving globalization, have they somewhere not been able to do justice to the gender question. We all know a man and a woman are biologically distinct, but when a woman's biology is used as a social construct to stop her from acquiring important global positions, to take her inputs in the sense of budgeting, to take her perspectives on policy making, on various important aspects that impact her directly, namely that is sanitation, water, population control, environmental management, industrial management, amongst others. So therefore, the feminist perspective also needs to be taken into account, that when we are striving for a safe world with globalization, are we doing enough for securing the world as a safe place, a better place for the women in terms of livelihoods, economy, household, safety, health, amongst others? Then when we are discussing the future of globalization, one also has to take into account the issue of pandemics, that is namely new non-traditional security dimensions that cut across border. Today the world saw with the coronavirus pandemic and the outbreak that how health became most important. Now, economic dimension of globalization often focused on global integration of world markets, rise of world markets. Now, this has to be seen in tandem, that health and economy are two sides of the same coin. Similarly, this also brings to us the earlier discussion that we are having, that sustainability and a global connected world have to be factored in together. And this again brings us to a other discussion, that is that when we are talking about integration, wherein technology has a huge role to play, one has to look into aspect of technological digital device, issues of ease and accessibility when it comes to ensuring that world moves forward with integration and exchange using the basis of developments in information, communication and technology. So therefore, once we try to understand globalization, we see that how the world has witnessed what Giddens said, that is intensification of worldwide social relations, or what Harvey said, that is witness of space-time compression, or what Skoll talked about deterritorialization, or what Gilpin talked about, that is integration of world economy. Globalization definitely has been a unique phase in human history. Globalization in all its dimension, namely political, with intensification of political relations, intergovernmental mechanisms, and at the same time some question marks, challenging aspects for the state's sovereignty and territory in terms of decision-making policy. For its economic aspect, namely today world markets are connected, but at the same time one cannot ignore the aspect of the instability that comes in with integration of markets, that how market and the economy is always a variable in a constant like globalization dealing with human individual lives, and above all the issue of democratic aspect in decision making, policy, procedures, establishment of international organization dealing with and taking the project of globalization forward. Then most important, the idea that ultimately our norms and values are being changed, and whether this change is it at the cost of ignoring of some. Is this change in our values and norms leading to a new kind of hegemony, or is it somewhere giving diversity a new platform? These questions that are there with globalization are often thought over, and the future of globalization, as we see, that is a world wherein we have to be integrated, we have to be connected, because solidarity, collective responsibility are always beneficial, but at the same time one cannot ignore the drawbacks that are there. That is, when we are there together in a connected world, there are collective risks also. So as we saw in our discussion, that how globalization and its future therefore is a tricky one. One has to have a good amount of deliberation in taking forward the future of globalization. The future definitely is that requires collaborative efforts, shared thinking, common concerns, and above all focusing on how today our gains as well as our risks are together. So therefore it requires that one has to look into various avenues of reforms as well as changes in order to present the human civilization a better existence based on sustainability, gender equality, based on concerns for environment, ecology, economic empowerment for all, removing poverty, underdevelopment, giving due emphasis to the aspects of state sovereignty and territoriality, amongst others. We hope you all gained some significant insights from this lecture on discussing and deliberating the future of globalization. Thank you.